We are going to continue to solve quadratic equations, and if you remember from yesterday, we have a couple steps that we need to follow, and the very first one before we do anything is to always put the equation in standard form, which would be from highest exponent to smallest exponent or constant and set equal to 0. It's going to be important to note that I'm going to have you guys always put your highest term, which would typically be your x squared term, positive. So we want to try and keep that ax squared term positive. It's not wrong if you don't keep it positive, but what happens is we haven't factored any of those where it's negative, and we haven't taken out a negative for a greatest common factor. So you're going to do yourself a favor if you set it equal to 0 with the ax squared term being positive. I'm going to do one today that has one where you have it negative just so you can see, but you'll do yourself a favor if you always make that x squared term positive. So for instance, if I look at number 1, all we're doing, we're not actually solving these, we're just going to write these in standard form. So if I want this 4x squared term, I have no other x squared term. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this over here, and I'm going to go ahead and move this 7x and this 15. So I would add 7x to this side and subtract 15 to this side. So basically all I'm doing is picking it up and plopping it over on the other side of the equal sign. And when I do that, remember they're going to change signs. So this becomes plus 7x minus 15. It doesn't matter if I write the 0 after the equation or if I write the 0 before the equation. It doesn't matter. Those are the same thing, but that is standard form. So if I look at number 2, I'm going to want to add this 3x squared over to the x because I want that to be positive. So when I add 3x squared over here, I get 0 equals 3x squared plus x. Here I have x squared minus 6x plus 2 equal to negative 3. My x squared, I have nothing to combine that with, so I'm going to leave it there because it's already positive. All I'm going to do is add this 3 over. Now notice this 3 can combine with that 2 because they are both constants. So I get x squared minus 6x plus 5 equal to 0. Number 4. I have negative 5x minus 13. I have a positive 7x squared here and an equals to a 3x squared. If I subtract this 3x squared over here, then that is going to keep it as positive 4x squared. I'm going to go ahead and write that first since I know that it needs to go in front. And then I'm just going to recopy this negative 5x minus 13 equals 0. So all I did was rearrange this. Make sure that you keep the signs that are in front of the term with the whole term. In this case, I'm going to add this 4x squared over here with this one, and I'm going to move this 16x over here, the 16 as well. But remember, I can't combine it with that x. Even though I wrote it right there, I can't really combine it with that x because that negative 16 is a constant. This is 1x squared plus 4x squared, which is 5x squared. And then the x would come next, and then minus 16 equal to 0. And that is standard form. So there's just a little bit of practice on that. Now, this says find the zeros of the following equation. It's important to note that if it says solve the equation for x, find the zeros, find the roots, okay, or even find the x-intercepts. Those all mean the same thing, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that next week. I just want you to start to get used to that language of zeros. That means that we're basically going to solve the equation for x, okay? All right, we're going to find those real solutions. So remember what I said about let's try and keep that x squared positive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add this 10x squared to the other side, because I need to put this in standard form first. So I get 0 equals 10x squared plus 8x. So that was check mark number 1. Is it set equal to 0? Yep. Check mark number 2 is it factored? And it's definitely not factored yet. When I have, the first thing I do when I look to factor something is I'm going to look to see if I have a greatest common factor. So I'm going to start with 10 and 8, and I look at 8. and I cannot divide both of them by 8. As I go down, I can't divide both of them by 6 or 4 or 5, but I can divide both of them by 2. And they both have an x. Both terms have an x, so I can take one out. When I take a 2x out of 10x squared, I'm left with 5x. This is because 10 divided by 2 is 5. X squared divided by x is x. When I do 8x divided by 2x, I'm left with 4. Again, let's just go check our answer. 2x times 5x, 10x squared. Yep, 2x times 4 is 8x. Okay, check mark. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set each factor equal to 0. One factor is 2x. The other factor is 5x plus 4. Remember, what you're asking yourself is 2 times what number is 0. So we want to do the opposite operation, which is division. 0 divided by 2 is 0. Think about that. When you plug 0 back in, does that make sense? Some of you are telling me it's 2 or negative 2. That wouldn't make any sense. On this one, we're going to subtract the 4 to the other side. We get 5x equals to negative 4. And again, to get that coefficient away from that variable, we need to divide by 5 to both sides. When I divide by 5 to both sides, I get negative 4/5. So one answer is 0 and one answer is negative 4/5. If you plugged both of those back in, it would satisfy that equation. When I look at number 7, again, step 1, set that equal to 0. That is not set equal to 0. My 4x squared is positive already, and I don't have anything to combine that with. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract my 5 over here. Now note, even though I'm writing it under that 19x, negative 19x, I don't combine those. So I have 4x squared minus 19x minus 5 equals 0. Okay. I need to now factor this. Step 1 was set equal to 0, right? Set equal to 0. Step 2, factor. I do not have a greatest common factor. I cannot take an x out of all 3 terms. This 5 doesn't have an x, and none of those are not divisible by anything. I then need to say, okay, I need to try and factor this. The tricky part here is I can have 4x and x, or I can have 2x and 2x, but I know that this has to be 1 and 5, okay? So I'm going to just try 2x and 2x. When I try 2x and 2x, I get 10x and 2x in the middle. That is not going to get me negative 19. So I'm going to go ahead and switch these to 4x and x and see what happens there. When I do 4x times 5x, I get 20x. And when I do 1 times x, I get 1x. Now that can get me negative 19. The way that would get me negative 19 is if that is negative 20. So that means that this has to be a negative 5, and that has to be a positive 1. Let's just double check that again just to be sure. 4x times x is 4x squared. 4x times negative 5 is negative 20x. 1 times x is positive 1x. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. That works. So my last step is setting each factor equal to 0. So I'm going to set 4x plus 1 equal to 0. And I'm going to set x minus 5 equal to 0. I'm going to subtract my 1. And then I'm going to divide by 4. So I get x equals negative 1/4. I have x minus 5 here. When I add 5, I get x equals 5. So one solution is negative 1/4, and one solution is 5. You could also say 1 0 is negative 1/4, and 1 0 is 5. Number 8, we need to set the equation equal to 0. I'm going to move the 25 over. I get x squared minus 25 equals 0. The second step is to factor. I do not have a greatest common factor other than 1. Not both terms have an x, so I know that I'm going to try and factor this by doing some binomial times some binomial. Because it's missing that middle term, or that bx term, or that middle term is 0, essentially if I wrote it like this, we know that what's in the parentheses need to be exactly the same, but one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. So I know that this has to be x times x, and I know that this has to be 5 and 5. Let's just double check. X times x, x squared. I get a positive 5x and a negative 5x. That's going to give me 0x, and negative 5 times positive 5 is 25. Negative 25. And then I'm going to set each term, each factor, x minus 5, I'm going to set equal to 0, and I'm going to set x plus 5 equal to 0. Therefore, I get 5, and I get negative 5. Remember, you can write that if you really wanted to. That's the same thing as plus or minus 5. Or you can list it as x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. Number 9. I am going to, before I do anything, I am going to take out set this equal to 0. This is already a positive 3x squared, so I'm going to go ahead and add the 6 to the other side. When I add 6, I get 3x squared minus 9x plus 6 equal to 0. I need to factor. The first question we always ask ourselves is there a greatest common factor? And there is, and that greatest common factor is 3. I can divide out 3 from 3x squared, and I'm left with x squared. When I undistribute a 3 or take out a 3 or divide negative 9x by 3, I get negative 3x. And when I do 6 divided by 3, I get 2. I then need to continue to factor that quadratic. I know that it needs to be x and x, and it's only got to be 1 and 2. I need it to be a positive 2, but a negative 3x, so therefore they're going to have to both be minus. Let's just double check that. X times x is x squared. X times negative 2 is negative 2x. Negative 1 times x is negative 1x. Yep, that gets me negative 3x. And negative 1 times negative 2 is positive 2. I have 3 terms. I'm going to set all 3 terms equal to 0. However, that 3 equal to 0 doesn't make any sense, right? There's no variable. I only have 2 x's, so I better only have 2 answers. When I add that 1 over, I get 1. When I add the 2 over, I get 2. So my 2 solutions are 1 and 2. Number 10, I get 12x equals 8x squared. I'm going to go ahead and move the 12x over here to keep that 8x squared positive. Once I have that in standard form, I need to attempt to factor that. That has the greatest common factor of 4x. When I take a 4x out of an 8x squared, I'm left with a 2x minus 3. Double check that. 4x times 2x, 8x squared. Yep. 4x times negative 3 is negative 12x. I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. One factor is 4x. The other factor is 2x minus 3. So I have 4x equals 0, and I have 2x minus 3 equals 0. I'm going to divide by 4, and I get x equals 0. On this one, I'm going to add 3. I get 2x equals 3. Divide by 2, I get 3/2. Number 11, don't multiply that. Look, we're set equal to 0. Yay! It's already factored. So all I have to do is set x plus 5 equal to 0 and x plus 12 equal to 0, and I'm done. So I have x plus 5 equals 0, x plus 12 equals 0. Subtract the 5, I get negative 5. When I subtract that 12, I get negative 12. Do not multiply after it's already done for you. Don't make more work for yourself. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.